The rain hammered against the tall windows of Hawthorne House like angry fists demanding justice. London, 1887. Midnight. Grace Ellison stood frozen in the dimly lit library, her fingers trembling so violently that the letter in her hands rustled like dry leaves in a storm. The words blurred before her eyes. Accusations of embezzlement. Her father's name dragged through the mud, the charitable fund of the Duke of Hawthorne plundered. A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around. From the shadows stepped Lucas Hawthorne, the Duke himself, tall, unyielding. His sharp jawline caught the faint glow of the dying fireplace, but his eyes were cold steel. Miss Ellison, his voice cut through the rain like a blade, low and controlled, yet heavy with barely contained fury. Your father has destroyed the honor of my family. He stole what was meant for the widows and orphans under my protection. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to scream that it couldn't be true, but the proof was right there, trembling between her fingers. Lucas took one slow step closer, the candlelight carving deep shadows across his face. To save your father from prison, and to salvage what little remains of your family's reputation, you will become my wife. He paused, letting the words sink in like stones into still water. Tomorrow morning. The world tilted beneath Grace's feet. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Marriage. To this man she had only seen from afar, a stranger whose name carried both power and grief, she felt as though she had been thrown into a bottomless pit of injustice where her freedom, her dreams, her very future were being traded for her father's life. I beg your pardon, Your Grace. Her voice was barely a whisper, cracking with disbelief and rising panic. You cannot be serious. I have never been more serious in my life. Lucas's gaze didn't waver. There was no warmth in it, only the cold calculation of a man who had already lost too much and refused to lose anything more. In the hallway just beyond the half-open door, a small figure appeared, 7-year-old Olivia Hawthorne clutching a worn rag doll to her chest. Her wide, frightened eyes locked onto Grace. The little girl took one hesitant step forward, then stopped, as if sensing the heavy storm gathering between the two adults. She looked at Grace the way one might look at a ghost that had suddenly stepped into her home. Grace's heart clenched. This child had already lost her mother. And now she was being forced to accept a stranger as her new mother. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, mirroring the chaos inside Grace's chest. She searched Lucas's face for even a flicker of mercy, a hint of hesitation, but all she saw was a man wrapped in layers of ice that hid deep, unspoken pain, the kind of pain that came from losing someone irreplaceable. You would bind me to you. Out of duty, she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and quiet defiance. With no affection, no choice. Lucas's jaw tightened. For the briefest moment, something raw flashed behind his eyes, a shadow of old grief before the mask slid back into place. Duty is all that remains to me now, Miss Ellison, and tomorrow you will stand beside me in front of Reverend Cole and speak your vows, or your father will spend the rest of his days in Newgate Prison, and your family name will be ruined forever. Silence swallowed the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the pounding rain. Grace closed her eyes for one heartbeat. In that single moment she saw every dream she had quietly nurtured, a life of quiet independence, perhaps teaching, perhaps helping the less fortunate on her own terms, shatter like fragile crystal. When she opened her eyes again, her voice came out steadier than she expected. Then it seems I have no choice. Lucas gave a single curt nod. No triumph. No satisfaction. Only the heavy weight of necessity. Be ready at dawn. He turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Grace alone with the letter, the rain, and the terrified eyes of little Olivia still watching her from the doorway. That night, sleep never came. By morning, the rain had not stopped. Under a gray, weeping sky in a small private chapel behind Hawthorne House, Grace Ellison became the Duchess of Hawthorne in a ceremony that lasted less than 15 minutes. There were no flowers, no guests. Only Reverend Cole's solemn voice, the patter of rain on the roof, and the distant rumble of thunder. When Lucas slipped the cold gold band onto her finger, his touch was brief, impersonal. Yet Grace felt it like a seal upon her fate. As they stepped out of the chapel, Olivia stood waiting under a large black umbrella held by Mrs. Eleanor Grant. The great house stretched around her, vast and beautiful, yet somehow colder than the London streets she had left behind. She drew in a slow breath. This was her home now. Or so they said. Every morning she made her way to the sunlit nursery on the second floor, determined to reach the one person who might need her most, little Olivia. Today Grace brought a small wooden box of watercolors and crisp sheets of paper. "Would you like to paint with me, Olivia?" she asked, gently kneeling beside the child's small table. "We could draw the garden or your favorite doll." Olivia's tiny fingers tightened around her rag doll. She didn't look up. Her dark lashes cast long shadows on her pale cheeks. The silence stretched between them like an invisible wall. From the doorway, Mrs. Eleanor Grant watched with folded arms, her expression carefully blank, yet unmistakably disapproving. "Her Grace may not be accustomed to the ways of this house," the housekeeper said quietly to a passing maid, just loud enough for Grace to hear. "Some things cannot be forced." Grace's cheeks burned, but she kept her voice soft. "I only wish to know her, Mrs. Grant. Nothing more." Later that afternoon, as Grace walked the long portrait gallery, another voice drifted from behind a marble column. "She is nothing but a purchased bride," Lady Beatrice Ashford murmured to a visiting cousin, her tone dripping with honeyed venom. "Bought to cover her father's crimes. How long before she poisons this house the way her family poisons everything they touch?" Grace stopped mid-step, her hand resting on the cool wood of the banister. She did not turn around. She simply stood there, letting the words sink into her chest like tiny blades. That evening the dinner table felt endless. Lucas sat at the far end, cutting his meal with precise mechanical movements. His eyes rarely left his plate. When Grace spoke of the garden or the weather, he answered with single words, "Yes, indeed, as you wish." No warmth, no curiosity, only the heavy, suffocating silence of a man who had learned to survive by feeling nothing at all. After dinner, Grace wandered alone into the East Wing library, seeking comfort in the rows of leather-bound books. As she reached for a volume on botany, a folded stack of old papers slipped from behind it and fluttered to the floor. She knelt to gather them. Her fingers froze. The documents were dated 2 years earlier, the year Charlotte Hawthorne had died. Among them was a sealed letter addressed to Theo Langford, the estate manager, with instructions written in a shaky hand. One line caught her eye: "Ensure the matter of the tonic remains between us alone." Grace's heart began to race. She quickly slipped the papers back into place, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. Why would Theo Langford hide documents about his late mistress's final days? Back in the dimly lit corridors, she passed Lucas once more. Their eyes met for the briefest second. He looked away first, his jaw tight, as though even meeting her gaze cost him something he was unwilling to give. That night, the great house grew quieter than ever. Grace sat at the edge of her massive 4-poster bed, still fully dressed. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. She thought of Olivia's frightened eyes. She thought of Mrs. Grant's cold politeness. She thought of Lady Beatrice's cruel whispers. And she thought of Lucas, the man who had forced her into this marriage, yet seemed trapped in his own invisible cage. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle any sound, but the sobs still escaped, soft, broken, and utterly alone. Was this what her life had become? A duchess in name only, living inside walls built of silence and suspicion. She wiped her tears with trembling fingers and stared into the dying fire. Who am I becoming in this house that is supposed to be mine? Grace closed her eyes, the weight of her new title pressing down on her chest like cold marble. And in the deepest corner of her heart, a quiet, desperate question lingered. How much longer could she endure this? Before the silence swallowed her whole, the winter wind howled across the frozen fields of Hawthorne Estate, wrapping the great house in a blanket of endless gray. Grace had learned to move through the long corridors like a ghost, quiet, careful, never demanding too much. But tonight the silence shattered. A sharp cry echoed from the nursery. Olivia Grace bolted from her sitting room without a second thought, her skirts tangling around her legs as she ran. She burst through the nursery door to find the little girl sprawled on the floor, a shattered porcelain vase beside her. Blood trickled from a deep cut on Olivia's small palm. The child's face was pale with shock and pain. Without hesitation, Grace dropped to her knees. "Shh, my darling. I'm here." She tore a strip from her own petticoat with steady hands, pressing the clean linen firmly against the wound. Olivia whimpered but leaned into Grace's chest, her tiny body trembling. Mrs. Eleanor Grant appeared moments later, eyes widening at the scene. "Your Grace, not now." Grace said softly but firmly, never taking her eyes off the child. "Bring warm water and bandages, quickly." In that moment something shifted. Lucas Hawthorne stood frozen in the doorway, his usual mask of ice cracking for the first time. He watched Grace cradle his daughter with such instinctive tenderness, her voice low and soothing as she whispered comforting words. For the briefest second, his hand twitched at his side as if he wanted to reach out, but he didn't. Later that evening, after Olivia had been settled into bed with her bandaged hand and a cup of warm milk, Lucas found Grace alone in the blue drawing room. The fire crackled softly. He poured 2 glasses of brandy, hesitated, then offered one to her. "You were very quick," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Most women would have called for the housekeeper first. Grace accepted the glass, but didn't drink. Her fingers tightened around the crystal. She was bleeding. "I couldn't just stand there." Lucas stared into the flames for a long moment. The silence between them felt different tonight, thinner, more fragile. She hasn't let anyone touch her like that since her mother. He stopped swallowing hard. Since Charlotte. The name hung in the air like smoke. Grace waited, heart pounding. Lucas continued his words, slow and pained, as though each one cost him dearly. "Sometimes I still hear her voice in these halls, laughing with Olivia, telling me not to work so late." He let out a bitter breath, and then she was gone. Just gone. He didn't look at Grace, but she saw the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his shoulders carried the weight of unspoken guilt. For the first time she glimpsed the man behind the Duke, a man drowning in grief he refused to release. The next afternoon brought a different kind of storm. Lady Beatrice had arranged a small gathering for neighboring gentry. The drawing room filled with polite laughter and clinking teacups, but beneath the surface the whispers grew sharper. "I heard her father nearly bankrupted the Duke's charity," one lady murmured behind her fan. "Purchased bride," another added with a delicate sniff. How tragic for poor little Olivia. Grace stood near the window, spine straight, when Lady Beatrice approached with a sweet, poisonous smile. "My dear Duchess," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you must be so relieved to have escaped your family's scandal. Though one does wonder how long before the Duke tires of playing savior." The room fell into uncomfortable silence. Grace felt every eye upon her. Heat rose to her cheeks, but she lifted her chin. "I did not come here to escape scandal, Lady Beatrice," she replied, her voice calm, yet edged with quiet steel. "I came because a child needed stability, and because sometimes duty asks more of us than we wish to give." Lucas, standing across the room, watched her with an unreadable expression. Something flickered in his eyes, respect perhaps, or the first crack in his carefully built walls. That night, long after the guests had gone, Grace slipped quietly into the east wing once more. She found the hidden papers behind the books exactly where she had left them. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the letter again, reading the damning line about the tonic and Theo Langford's name. Her stomach twisted. Why was the estate manager hiding documents about Charlotte's final illness? What was he so afraid of? She folded the papers carefully and tucked them into the pocket of her dressing gown. Her heart raced with a dangerous mix of fear and determination. Back in her chambers, Grace stood before the mirror, staring at the woman reflected there, the Duchess in fine silk, yet still feeling like the daughter of a disgraced man. She was trapped. Loyalty to her new husband pulled her one way. The need for truth, for justice, for her own father, and perhaps even for Charlotte pulled her the other. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she whispered to her reflection, "I will not live in shadows forever." With steady hands, she sat at her writing desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began to write a short, carefully worded note. It was addressed to Reverend Cole. She sealed it with wax, her fingers lingering on the crest. Tomorrow she would find a way to send it. Grace blew out the candle and climbed into bed, her mind spinning with questions and quiet resolve. The walls of Hawthorne Estate felt thicker than ever, but for the first time she had decided to push back against them, and somewhere in the darkness, a door to darker truths had just begun to creak open. The night air inside Lucas's private study carried the faint scent of aged leather and cold ash. Grace moved like a shadow, her candle casting long, trembling flickers across the dark wood panels. Her heart hammered so loudly she feared it might wake the entire house. She had waited until the clock struck 2. With steady but nervous fingers, she slid the small key she had quietly taken from Lucas's desk drawer into the hidden compartment. The lock clicked open. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. Grace unfolded the top one, her breath shallow. The words hit her like ice water. The tonic was administered as instructed. Charlotte Hawthorne felt no pain in her final hours. The estate and the revised will are now secure under your control, Mr. Langford, signed in Theo Langford's own hand. Grace's knees buckled. She gripped the edge of the desk to keep from falling. Charlotte hadn't died of illness. She had been poisoned by the very man who managed every penny and every secret of Hawthorne Estate. Theo Langford had murdered the previous Duchess to seize control of the inheritance and the will. A wave of nausea rolled through Grace. She pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes stinging with horror. Olivia, the little girl, was living under the same roof as her mother's killer, and Grace. She was now trapped between her growing loyalty to Lucas and the terrifying need to protect his daughter. She quickly retied the letters exactly as she had found them, but the truth burned inside her chest like fire. The next morning she cornered Theo Langford in the estate office. The man looked up from his ledgers, his smile polite but his eyes sharp. "Your Grace," he said smoothly. "How may I serve you?" Grace kept her voice low and steady, though her hands shook behind her back. "I know what you did to Charlotte." Theo's expression didn't change at first, then a slow, dangerous smile curved his lips. "Careful, Duchess. Accusations like that can be very costly." He rose slowly, towering over her. "You are new here. You have no proof. And if you breathe a word of this nonsense, I will make sure your father's embezzlement case is reopened with fresh evidence that sends him straight to the gallows. Not only that, accidents happen to curious little girls who ask too many questions." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. He had threatened Olivia directly. She backed away, pulse roaring in her ears, and fled the office without another word. The sky had turned heavy with snow by afternoon. Grace stood alone in the frozen garden flakes swirling around her like silent accusations. Her thin shawl offered no protection against the biting wind. She wrapped her arms around herself, body trembling, but her eyes burned with fierce resolve. She would not stay silent. Not anymore. From the upper window of the study, Lucas watched her. He had come looking for a missing ledger when he saw her standing there, small, alone, shivering in the snow, yet radiating a quiet, unbreakable strength he had never allowed himself to see before. Something deep inside his chest cracked open. He grabbed his coat and strode out into the storm. Grace. She turned at the sound of his voice. Snow clung to her lashes. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold and unshed tears. Lucas stopped just inches away. For the first time, he really looked at her not as the woman he had forced into marriage, but as the woman who had quietly been fighting for his daughter, and perhaps for him. "You're freezing," he said softly. "I had to think," she whispered, voice breaking. "I can't pretend anymore, Lucas." He reached out, hesitating only a moment before gently pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Then don't pretend," he said. His voice was rough with emotion. "Tell me what's tearing you apart." Grace looked up into his eyes, searching. "I found the letters. About Charlotte. Theo Langford. He poisoned her. He admitted it to me. He threatened Olivia if I spoke." Lucas's face went deathly pale. The mask he had worn for years shattered completely. "I suspected something was wrong after she died," he admitted, voice hoarse. "But I was drowning in grief. I let Theo handle everything because I couldn't face it. When your father's scandal broke, I used it as an excuse. I married you to bury the rumors and protect the estate. Not because I trusted you, because I was a coward." He swallowed hard pain raw in his eyes. "I never meant to trap you in my darkness, Grace." Tears finally spilled down her cheeks, mixing with the snow. "I won't live in lies anymore," she said, her voice gaining strength, even as it trembled. "Not even if it costs me everything. Not even if it means losing this title, or this house. Olivia deserves the truth. And so do you." Lucas stared at her for a long moment, something fierce and tender awakening in his gaze. "Then we face it together," he whispered. But Grace shook her head slowly. "Not yet." That night alone in her room, Grace sat at her desk once more. Her hands no longer shook as she wrote the second letter to Reverend Cole. She detailed everything she had discovered, sealed it carefully, and hid it inside her prayer book. Tomorrow she would ensure it reached him. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside Grace's heart a quiet fire had been lit. One that would either burn down the walls of Hawthorne Estate or finally bring light into its deepest shadows. And the fate of an entire family now hung by the fragile thread of her courage. The grand drawing room of Hawthorne Estate had never felt so heavy with tension. Sunlight struggled through the tall windows on this early spring morning, casting long golden beams across the polished oak table where the emergency family meeting had been called. Mr. Whitaker, the family solicitor, sat with a stack of documents, his face pale. Theo Langford stood near the fireplace, hands clasped tightly behind his back. Lady Beatrice Ashford occupied the chair beside him, her usual smug smile frozen in place. Grace stood at the head of the table, heart pounding so fiercely she could feel it in her throat. Lucas sat to her right, his posture rigid, but his eyes never left her face. She drew in one slow, steady breath. Then she began. "I called this meeting because the shadows in this house have grown too long," Grace said, her voice clear and unwavering despite the tremor in her hands. "And I will no longer allow them to swallow us." She placed the bundle of letters on the table. These documents proved that Charlotte Hawthorne did not die of illness. She was poisoned. Slowly, deliberately. A collective gasp filled the room. Grace's gaze locked onto Theo Langford. "By you, Mr. Langford. You altered the will. You controlled the estate. You murdered your mistress to secure power and fortune for yourself." Theo's face drained of color. "You have no proof I have your own handwriting," Grace interrupted softly, yet with steel beneath every word. And I have witnesses who will confirm the suspicious tonic you administered in her final weeks. She turned to Lady Beatrice, who had gone deathly still. And you helped him. You spread the rumors about my father. You whispered poison into every ear, willing to listen, hoping I would be disgraced and removed so you could take my place as the next Duchess, all to hide Theo's crime and claim the inheritance for yourselves. Lady Beatrice shot to her feet. This is outrageous, Lucas. You cannot believe this woman. I believe my wife, Lucas said quietly, rising beside Grace. The room fell silent. He looked at Grace for a long moment, then turned to the others, his voice rough with emotion. I made a terrible mistake. I forced Grace into this marriage to bury the scandal surrounding her father and protect the estate's reputation. I did it out of fear, not trust. I hid behind duty because I was too broken to face the truth about Charlotte's death. His hand found Grace's on the table, fingers intertwining with hers, warm, steady, and real. But she refused to let the lies continue. She risked everything to bring the truth into the light. And today, I stand with her, completely. Theo lunged forward in panic, but Mr. Whittaker raised a hand. The evidence is irrefutable, Mr. Langford. The authorities have already been notified. Mrs. Eleanor Grant, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she looked at Grace. I have served this house for 20 years, she said, voice thick. I saw the darkness, but I was afraid to speak. Today I witnessed true courage. From this moment on, Your Grace, you have my full loyalty and support. Grace's eyes softened with gratitude. Then came the moment that broke every wall left standing. Little Olivia slipped into the room, drawn by the raised voices. She hesitated at the threshold, clutching her rag doll. Her wide eyes moved from her father to Grace, and then she ran. Straight into Grace's arms. Mama, Olivia whispered, burying her face in Grace's neck. Don't let them take you away. Grace's breath caught. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she held the little girl close, stroking her hair with trembling hands. I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart, she murmured against Olivia's curls. I promise. Lucas watched them, his own eyes glistening. For the first time in years, the hard lines of his face softened into something tender and hopeful. The spring sun grew brighter outside. Weeks later, the heavy clouds that had lingered over Hawthorne Estate finally lifted. Grace walked slowly along the garden path, Olivia's small hand tucked securely in hers. Lucas walked on the child's other side, his fingers occasionally brushing Grace's as they moved. The daffodils and early crocuses had pushed through the earth, painting the grounds in soft yellows and purples. The air smelled of fresh grass and new beginnings. No more silence filled the halls. Instead, there were soft conversations over breakfast, Olivia's laughter echoing through the nursery as Grace read to her, and quiet evenings where Lucas and Grace sat together by the fire, not as strangers bound by duty, but as two wounded souls learning to trust again. As they reached the small stone folly at the edge of the garden, Lucas stopped and turned to Grace. I once believed honor meant protecting the family name at any cost, he said quietly. You taught me that real honor is having the courage to face the truth no matter how painful. Grace looked up at him, the spring light catching in her eyes. And I learned that even a marriage born from injustice can become something beautiful, when both people choose honesty over convenience. Olivia tugged gently on their hands, pulling them forward. Come on, Mama, Papa, let's go home. The three of them continued walking together, hands joined beneath the warm spring sun. Hawthorne Estate no longer felt like a place of shadows and whispered secrets. It had become a home warm, honest, and filled with the quiet promise of love that had grown slowly, bravely from the most unlikely beginning. And in that gentle light, 3 broken hearts had finally begun to heal. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process, but every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.